Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell. Chapter 21. This life went on for about a fortnight, with a slight increase of work as more customers came to the restaurant. I could have saved an hour a day by taking a room near the restaurant, but it seemed impossible to find time to change lodgings, or for that matter, to get my hair cut, look at a newspaper, or even undress completely. After 10 days, I managed to find a free quarter of an hour and wrote to my friend B in London, asking him if he could get me a job of some sort, anything, so long as it allowed me more than 5 hours sleep. I was simply not equal to going on with a 17-hour day, though there are plenty of people who think nothing of it. When one is overworked, it is a good cure for self-pity to think of the thousands of people in Paris restaurants who work such hours and will go on doing it, not for a few weeks, but for years. There was a girl in a bistro near my hotel who worked from 7 in the morning till midnight for a whole year, only sitting down to her meals. I remember once asking her to come to a dance, and she laughed and said she had not been farther than the street corner for several months. She was consumptive and died about the time I left Paris. After only a week, we were all neurasthenic with fatigue, except Jules, who skulked persistently. The quarrels, intermittent at first, had now become continuous. For hours one would keep up a drizzle of useless nagging, rising into storms of abuse every few minutes. "Get me down that saucepan, idiot!" the cook would cry. She was not tall enough to reach the shelves where the saucepans were kept. "Get it down yourself, you old whore," I would answer. Such remarks seemed to be generated spontaneously from the air of the kitchen. We quarreled over things of inconceivable pettiness. The dustbin, for instance, was an unending source of quarrels, whether it should be put where I wanted it, which was in the cook's way, or where she wanted it, which was between me and the sink. Once, she nagged and nagged until at last, in pure spite, I lifted the dustbin up and put it out in the middle of the floor, where she was bound to trip over it. "Now, you cow," I said, "move it yourself." Poor old woman. It was too heavy for her to lift, and she sat down, put her head on the table, and burst out crying. And I jeered at her. This is the kind of effect that fatigue has upon one's manners. After a few days, the cook had ceased talking about Tolstoy and her artistic nature, and she and I were not on speaking terms, except for the purposes of work. Boris and Jules were not on speaking terms, and neither of them was on speaking terms with the cook. Even Boris and I were barely on speaking terms. We had agreed beforehand that the ongulades of working hours did not count between times, but we had called each other things too bad to be forgotten, and besides, there were no between times. Jules grew lazier and lazier, and he stole food constantly, from a sense of duty, he said. He called the rest of us Jean, blackleg, when we would not join with him in stealing. He had a curious, malignant spirit. He told me as a matter of pride that he had sometimes wrung a dirty dishcloth into a customer's soup before taking it in, just to be revenged upon a member of the bourgeoisie. The kitchen grew dirtier, and the rats bolder, though we trapped a few of them, looking around that filthy room with raw meat lying among refuse on the floor, and cold clotted saucepans sprawling everywhere, and the sink blocked and coated with grease. I used to wonder whether there could be a restaurant in the world as bad as ours. But the other three all said that they had been in dirtier places. Jules took a positive pleasure in seeing things dirty. In the afternoon, when he had not much to do. He used to stand in the kitchen doorway, jeering at us for working too hard. "Fool! Why do you wash that plate? Wipe it on your trousers. Who cares about the customers? They don't know what's going on. What is restaurant work? You are carving a chicken and it falls on the floor. You apologize, you bow, you go out. In 5 minutes, you come back by another door with the same chicken. That is restaurant work," etc. And, strange to say, in spite of all this filth and incompetence, the Auberge de Giron-Cotard was actually a success. For the first few days, all our customers were Russians, friends of the patron, and these were followed by Americans and other foreigners, no Frenchmen. Then one night, there was tremendous excitement because our first Frenchman had arrived. For a moment, our quarrels were forgotten, and we all united in the effort to serve a good dinner. Boris tiptoed into the kitchen, jerked his thumb over his shoulder, and whispered conspiratorially, "Shh, attention, en français." A moment later, the patron's wife came and whispered, "Attention, en français. See that he gets a double portion of all the vegetables." While the Frenchman ate, the patron's wife stood behind the grill of the kitchen door and watched the expression of his face. Next night, the Frenchman came back with 2 other Frenchmen. This meant that we were earning a good name. The surest sign of a bad restaurant is to be frequented only by foreigners. Probably part of the reason for our success was that the patron, with the sole gleam of sense he had shown in fitting out the restaurant, had bought very sharp table knives. Sharp knives, of course, are the secret of a successful restaurant. I am glad that this happened, for it destroyed one of my illusions, namely the idea that Frenchmen know good food when they see it. Or perhaps we were a fairly good restaurant by Paris standards, in which case the bad ones must be past imagining. In a very few days after I had written to B, he replied to say that there was a job he could get for me. It was to look after a congenital imbecile, which sounded a splendid rest cure after the Auberge de Giron-Cotard. I pictured myself loafing in the country lanes, knocking thistle heads off with my stick, feeding on roast lamb and treacle tart, and sleeping 10 hours a night in sheets smelling of lavender. B sent me a $5 to pay my passage and get my clothes out of the pawn, and as soon as the money arrived, I gave 1 day's notice and left the restaurant. My leaving so suddenly embarrassed the patron, for as usual, he was penniless, and he had to pay my wages 30 francs short. However, he stood me a glass of Courvoisier 48 brandy, and I think he felt this made up the difference. They engaged a Czech, a thoroughly competent plongeur, in my place, and the poor old cook was sacked a few weeks later. Afterwards, I heard that with 2 first-rate people in the kitchen, the plongeur's work had been cut down to 15 hours a day. Below that, no one could have cut it, short of modernizing the kitchen. Chapter 22. For what they are worth, I want to give my opinions about the life of a Paris plongeur. When one comes to think of it, it is strange that thousands of people in a great modern city should spend their waking hours swabbing dishes in hot dens underground. The question I am raising is why this life goes on, what purpose it serves, and who wants it to continue, and why I am not taking the merely rebellious, fainéant attitude. I am trying to consider the social significance of a plongeur's life. I think one should start by saying that a plongeur is one of the slaves of the modern world. Not that there is any need to whine over him, for he is better off than many manual workers, but still, he is no freer than if he were bought and sold. His work is servile and without art. He is paid just enough to keep him alive. His only holiday is the sack. He is cut off from marriage, or if he marries, his wife must work too. Except by a lucky chance, he has no escape from this life, save into prison. At this moment, there are men with university degrees scrubbing dishes in Paris for 10 or 15 hours a day. One cannot say that it is mere idleness on their part, for an idle man cannot be a plongeur. They have simply been trapped by a routine which makes thought impossible. If plongeurs thought at all, they would long ago have formed a union and gone on strike for better treatment. But they do not think, because they have no leisure for it. Their life has made slaves of them. The question is, why does this slavery continue? People have a way of taking it for granted that all work is done for a sound purpose. They see somebody else doing a disagreeable job and think that they have solved things by saying that the job is necessary. Coal mining, for example, is hard work. But it is necessary. We must have coal. Working in the sewers is unpleasant, but somebody must work in the sewers. And similarly with a plongeur's work. Some people must feed in restaurants, and so other people must swab dishes for 80 hours a week. It is the work of civilization, therefore, unquestionable. This point is worth considering. Is a plongeur's work really necessary to civilization? We have a feeling that it must be honest work because it is hard and disagreeable, and we have made a sort of fetish of manual work. We see a man cutting down a tree, and we make sure that he is filling a social need just because he uses his muscles. It does not occur to us that he may only be cutting down a beautiful tree to make room for a hideous statue. I believe it is the same with a plongeur. He earns his bread in the sweat of his brow, but it does not follow that he's doing anything useful. He may be only supplying a luxury which, very often, is not a luxury. As an example of what I mean by luxuries which are not luxuries, take an extreme case, such as one hardly sees in Europe. Take an Indian rickshaw puller or gharry pony. In any Far Eastern town, there are rickshaw pullers by the 100, black wretches weighing 8 stone, clad in loincloths. Some of them are diseased. Some of them are 50 years old. For miles on end, they trot in the sun or rain, head down, dragging at the shafts, with the sweat dripping from their gray mustaches. When they go too slowly, the passenger calls them bahinchut. They earn 30 or 40 rupees a month and cough their lungs out after a few years. The gharry ponies are gaunt, vicious things that have been sold cheap as of having a few years' work left in them. Their master looks on the whip as a substitute for food. Their work expresses itself in a sort of equation. Whip plus food equals energy. Generally, it is about 60% whip and 40% food. Sometimes their necks are encircled by one vast sore, so that they drag all day on raw flesh. It is still possible to make them work, however. It is just a question of thrashing them so hard that the pain behind outweighs the pain in front. After a few years, even the whip loses its virtue, and the pony goes to the knacker. These are instances of unnecessary work, for there is no real need for gharries and rickshaws. They only exist because Orientals consider it vulgar to walk. They are luxuries, and as anyone who has ridden in them know, very poor luxuries. They afford a small amount of convenience, which cannot possibly balance the suffering of the men and animals. Similarly with the plongeur. He is a king compared with a rickshaw puller or a Gary pony, but his case is analogous. He is the slave of a hotel or a restaurant, and his slavery is more or less useless. For after all, where is the real need of big hotels and smart restaurants? They are supposed to provide luxury, but in reality, they provide only a cheap, shoddy imitation of it. Nearly everyone hates hotels. Some restaurants are better than others, but it is impossible to get as good a meal in a restaurant as one can get for the same expense in a private house. No doubt, hotels and restaurants must exist, but there is no need that they should enslave hundreds of people. What makes the work in them is not the essentials. It is the shams that are supposed to represent luxury. Smartness, as it is called, means in effect merely that the staff work more and the customers pay more. No one benefits except the proprietor, who will presently buy himself a striped villa at Deauville. Essentially, a smart hotel is a place where 100 people toil like devils in order that 200 may pay through the nose for things they do not really want. If the nonsense were cut out of hotels and restaurants and the work done with simple efficiency, plongeurs might work 6 or 8 hours a day, instead often of 15. Suppose it is granted that a plongeur's work is more or less useless. Then the question follows, why does anyone want him to go on working? I am trying to go beyond the immediate economic cause and to consider what pleasure it can give someone to think of men swabbing dishes for life. For there is no doubt that comfortably situated people do find a pleasure in such thoughts. A slave, Marcus Cato said, should be working when he is not sleeping. It does not matter whether his work is needed or not. He must work because work in itself is good, for slaves at least. This sentiment still survives, and it has piled up mountains of useless drudgery. I believe that this instinct to perpetuate useless work is at bottom simply fear of the mob. The mob, the thought runs, are such low animals that they would be dangerous if they had leisure. It is safer to keep them too busy to think. A rich man who happens to be intellectually honest, if he is questioned about the improvement of working conditions, usually says something like this, quote, "We know that poverty is unpleasant. In fact, since it is so remote, we rather enjoy harrowing ourselves with the thought of its unpleasantness, but don't expect us to do anything about it. We are sorry for you lower classes, just as we are sorry for a cat with the mange. But we will fight like devils against any improvement of your condition. We feel that you are much safer as you are. The present state of affairs suits us, and we are not going to take the risk of setting you free, even by an extra hour a day. So, dear brothers, since evidently you must sweat to pay for our trips to Italy, sweat and be damned to you." End quote. This is particularly the attitude of intelligent, cultivated people. One can read the substance of it in 100 essays. Very few cultivated people have less than, say, £400 a year, and naturally they side with the rich, because they imagine that any liberty conceded to the poor is a threat to their own liberty. Foreseeing some dismal Marxian utopia as the alternative, the educated man prefers to keep things as they are. Possibly he does not like his fellow rich very much, but he supposes that even the vulgarest of them are less inimical to his pleasures, more his kind of people than the poor, and that he had better stand by them. It is this fear of a supposedly dangerous mob that makes nearly all intelligent people conservative in their opinions. Fear of the mob is a superstitious fear. It is based on the idea that there is some mysterious, fundamental difference between rich and poor, as though they are two different races like Negroes and white men. But in reality, there is no such difference. The mass of the rich and poor are differentiated by their incomes and nothing else. And the average millionaire is only the average dishwasher dressed in a new suit. Change places and handy-dandy. Which is the justice? Which is the thief? Everyone who has mixed on equal terms with the poor knows this quite well. But the trouble is that intelligent, cultivated people, the very people who might be expected to have liberal opinions, never do mix with the poor. For what do the majority of educated people know about poverty? In my copy of Villon's poems, the editor has actually thought it necessary to explain the line "n'est pas ne voyant qu'at finir" by a footnote. So remote is even hunger from the educated man's experience. From this ignorance, a superstitious fear of the mob results quite naturally. The educated man pictures a horde of sub-men, wanting only a day's liberty to loot his house, burn his books, and set him to work minding a machine or sweeping out a lavatory. Anything, he thinks, any injustice sooner than let that mob loose. He does not see that since there is no difference between the mass of rich and poor, there is no question of setting the mob loose. The mob is in fact loose now, and in the shape of rich men. It's using its power to set up enormous treadmills of boredom, such as smart hotels. To sum up, a plongeur is a slave, and a wasted slave, doing stupid and largely unnecessary work. He is kept at work ultimately because of a vague feeling that he would be dangerous if he had leisure. And educated people, who should be on his side, acquiesce in the process because they know nothing about him, and consequently are afraid of him. I say this of the plongeur because it is his case I have been considering. It would apply equally to numberless other types of worker. These are only my own ideas about the basic facts of a plongeur's life, made without reference to immediate economic questions, and no doubt largely platitudes. I present them as a sample of the thoughts that are put into one's head by working in an hotel. Chapter 23. As soon as I left the Auberge de Jehan-Cotard, I went to bed and slept the clock round. All but 1 hour. Then I washed my teeth for the first time in a fortnight, bathed, and had my hair cut, and got my clothes out of pawn. I had 2 glorious days of loafing. I even went in my best suit to the auberge, leant against the bar, and spent 5 francs on a bottle of English beer. It is a curious sensation, being a customer where you have been a slave's slave. Boris was sorry that I had left the restaurant just at the moment when we were lancés, and there was a chance of making money. I have heard from him since, and he tells me that he is making 100 francs a day and has set up a girl who is très sérieuse and never smells of garlic. I spent a day wandering about our quarter, saying goodbye to everyone. It was on this day that Charlie told me about the death of old Roucol, the miser, who had once lived in the quarter. Very likely Charlie was lying as usual, but it was a good story. Roucol died, age 74, a year or 2 before I went to Paris. But the people in the quarter still talked of him while I was there. He never equaled Daniel Dancer or anyone of that kind, but he was an interesting character. He went to Le Halles every morning to pick up damaged vegetables, and ate cat's meat and wore newspaper instead of underclothes, and used the wainscoting of his room for firewood, and made himself a pair of trousers out of a sack, All this with 500,000 francs invested. I should very much like to have known him. Like many misers, Roucault came to a bad end through putting his money into a wildcat scheme. One day, a Jew appeared in the quarter, an alert, businesslike young chap who had a first-rate plan for smuggling cocaine into England. It is easy enough, of course, to buy cocaine in Paris, and the smuggling would be quite simple in itself, only there is always some spy who betrays the plan to the customs or the police. It is said that this is often done by the very people who sell the cocaine, because the smuggling trade is in the hands of a large combine who do not want competition. The Jew, however, swore that there was no danger. He knew a way of getting cocaine directly from Vienna, not through the usual channels, and there would be no blackmail to pay. He had got into touch with Roucault through a young Pole, a student at the Sorbonne, who was going to put 4,000 francs into the scheme if Roucault would put 6,000. For this, they could buy 10 pounds of cocaine, which would be worth a small fortune in England. The Pole and the Jew had a tremendous struggle to get the money from between old Roucault's claws. 6,000 francs was not much. He had more than that sewn into the mattress in his room. But it was agony for him to part with a sou. The Pole and the Jew were at him for weeks on end, explaining, bullying, coaxing, arguing, going down on their knees and imploring him to produce the money. The old man was half frantic between greed and fear. His bowels yearned at the thought of getting perhaps 50,000 francs profit, and yet he could not bring himself to risk the money. He used to sit in a corner with his head in his hands, groaning and sometimes yelling out in agony, and often he would kneel down, he was very pious, and pray for strength, but still he couldn't do it. But at last, more from exhaustion than anything else, he gave in quite suddenly. He slid open the mattress where his money was concealed and handed over 6,000 francs to the Jew. The Jew delivered the cocaine the same day and promptly vanished. And meanwhile, as was not surprising after the fuss Roucault had made, the affair had been noised all over the quarter. The very next morning the hotel was raided and searched by the police. Roucault and the Pole were in agonies. The police were downstairs, working their way up and searching every room in turn. And there was the great packet of cocaine on the table, with no place to hide it and no chance of escaping down the stairs. The Pole was for throwing the stuff out of the window, but Roucault would not hear of it. Charlie told me that he had been present at the scene. He said that when they tried to take the packet from Roucault, he clasped it to his breast and struggled like a madman, although he was 74 years old. He was wild with fright, but he would go to prison rather than throw his money away. At last, when the police were searching only one floor below, somebody had an idea. A man on Roucault's floor had a dozen tins of face powder, which he was selling on commission. It was suggested that the cocaine could be put into the tins and passed off as face powder. The powder was hastily thrown out of the window and the cocaine substituted, and the tins were put openly on Roucault's table as though they were nothing to conceal. A few minutes later, the police came to search Roucault's room. They tapped the walls and looked up the chimney and turned out the drawers and examined the floorboards, and then, just as they were about to give up, having found nothing, the inspector noticed the tins on the table. "Tins," he said. "Have a look at those tins. I hadn't noticed them. What's in them, eh?" "Face powder," said the Pole as calmly as he could manage. But at the same instant Roucault let out a loud groaning noise from alarm, and the police became suspicious immediately. They opened one of the tins and tipped out the contents, and after smelling it, the inspector said that he believed it was cocaine. Roucault and the Pole began swearing on the names of the saints that it was only face powder. But it was no use. The more they protested, the more suspicious the police became. The two men were arrested and led off to the police station, followed by half the quarter. At the station, Roucault and the Pole were interrogated by the commissaire, while a tin of the cocaine was sent away to be analyzed. Charlie said that the scene Roucault made was beyond description. He wept, prayed, made contradictory statements, and denounced the Pole all at once, so loud that he could be heard half a street away. The policeman almost burst with laughing at him. After an hour, a policeman came back with a tin of cocaine and a note from the analyst. He was laughing. "This is not cocaine, monsieur," he said. "What? Not cocaine?" said the commissar. "Mais alors, what is it then?" "It is face powder." Roucault and the Pole were released at once, entirely exonerated but very angry. The Jew had double-crossed them. Afterwards, when the excitement was over, it turned out that he had played the same trick on 2 other people in the quarter. The Pole was glad enough to escape, even though he had lost his 4,000 francs, but poor old Roucault was utterly broken down. He took to his bed at once, and all that day and half the night they could hear him thrashing about, mumbling and sometimes yelling out at the top of his voice, 6,000 francs, nom de Jésus-Christ, 6,000 francs. 3 days later, he had some kind of stroke, and in a fortnight, he was dead. Of a broken heart, Charlie said. Chapter 24. I traveled to England 3rd class via Dunkirk and Tilbury, which is the cheapest and not the worst way of crossing the Channel. You had to pay extra for a cabin, so I slept in the saloon, together with most of the 3rd class passengers. I find this entry in my diary for that day. Sleeping in the saloon, 27 men, 16 women. Of the women, not a single one has washed her face this morning. The men mostly went to the bathroom. The women merely produced vanity cases and covered the dirt with powder. Question: a secondary sexual difference? On the journey, I fell in with a couple of Romanians, mere children, who were going to England on their honeymoon trip. They asked innumerable questions about England, and I told them some startling lies. I was so pleased to be getting home after being hard up for months in a foreign city that England seemed to me a sort of paradise. There are, indeed, many things in England that make you glad to get home. Bathrooms, armchairs, mint sauce, new potatoes properly cooked, brown bread, marmalade, beer made with veritable hops. They are all splendid, if you can pay for them. England is a very good country when you are not poor, and of course, with the tame imbecile to look after, I was not going to be poor. The thought of not being poor made me very patriotic. The more questions the Romanians asked, the more I praised England. The climate, the scenery, the art, the literature, the laws, everything in England was perfect. Was the architecture in England good? The Romanians asked. Splendid, I said, and you should see the London statues. Paris is vulgar, half grandiosity and half slums, but London. Then the boat drew alongside Tilbury Pier. The first building we saw on the waterside was one of those huge hotels, all stucco and pinnacles, which stare from the English coast like idiots staring over an asylum wall. I saw the Romanians, too polite to say anything, cocking their eyes at the hotel. Built by French architects, I assured them. And even later, when the train was crawling into London through the eastern slums, I still kept it up about the beauties of English architecture. Nothing seemed too good to say about England, now that I was coming home and was not hard up anymore. I went to B's office, and his first words knocked everything to ruins. "I'm sorry," he said. "Your employees have gone abroad, patient and all. However, they'll be back in a month. I suppose you can hang on till then?" I was outside in the street before it even occurred to me to borrow some more money. There was a month to wait, and I had exactly 19 and 6 pence in hand. The news had taken my breath away for a long time. I could not make up my mind what to do. I loafed the day in the streets, and at night, not having the slightest notion of how to get a cheap bed in London, I went to a family hotel, where the charge was 7 and 6 pence. After paying the bill, I had 10 and 2 pence in hand. By the morning, I had made my plans. Sooner or later, I should have to go to B for more money, but it seemed hardly decent to do so yet, and in the meantime, I must exist in some hole-and-corner way. Past experience set me against pawning my best suit. I would leave all my things at the station cloakroom except my second best suit, which I could exchange for some cheap clothes and perhaps £1. If I was going to live a month on 30 shillings, I must have bad clothes. Indeed, the worse the better. Whether 30 shillings could be made to last a month, I had no idea, not knowing London as I knew Paris. Perhaps I could bake or sell bootlaces. And I remembered articles I had read in the Sunday papers about beggars who have £2,000 sewn into their trousers. It was, at any rate, notoriously impossible to starve in London, so there was nothing to be anxious about. To sell my clothes, I went into Lambeth, where the people are poor and there are a lot of rag shops. At the first shop I tried, the proprietor was polite but unhelpful. At the second, he was rude. At the third, he was stone deaf or pretended to be so. The fourth shopman was a large, blond young man, very pink all over, like a slice of ham. He looked at the clothes I was wearing and felt them disparagingly between thumb and finger. "Poor stuff," he said. "Very poor stuff, that is." It was quite a good suit. "What you want for 'em?" I explained that I wanted some older clothes and as much money as he could spare. He thought for a moment, then collected some dirty-looking rags and threw them on the counter. "What about the money?" I said, hoping for £1. He pursed his lips and then produced a shilling and laid it beside the clothes. I did not argue. I was going to argue, but as I opened my mouth, he reached out as though to take up the shilling again. I saw that I was helpless. He let me change in a small room behind the shop. The clothes were a coat, once dark brown, a pair of black dungaree trousers, a scarf, and a cloth cap. I had kept my own shirt, socks, and boots, and had a comb and razor in my pocket. It gives one a very strange feeling to be wearing such clothes. I had worn bad enough things before, but nothing at all like these. They were not merely dirty and shapeless. They had, how is one to express it, a gracelessness, a patina of antique filth, quite different from mere shabbiness. They were the sort of clothes you see on a bootlace seller or a tramp. An hour later, in Lambeth, I saw a hangdog man, obviously a tramp, coming towards me, and when I looked again, it was myself, reflected in a shop window. The dirt was plastering my face already. Dirt is a great respecter of persons. It lets you alone when you are well dressed, but as soon as your collar is gone, it flies toward you from all directions. I stayed in the streets till late at night, keeping on the move all the time. Dressed as I was half afraid that the police might arrest me as a vagabond, and I dared not speak to anyone, imagining that they must notice a disparity between my accent and my clothes. Later, I discovered that this never happened. My new clothes had put me instantly into a new world. Everyone's demeanor seemed to have changed abruptly. I helped a hawker pick up a barrow that he had upset. "Thanks, mate," he said, with a grin. No one had called me mate before in my life. It was the clothes that had done it. For the first time I noticed, too, how the attitude of women varies with a man's clothes. When a badly dressed man passes them, they shudder away from him with a quite frank movement of disgust, as though he were a dead cat. Clothes are powerful things. Dressed in a tramp's clothes, it is very difficult, at any rate for the first day, not to feel that you are genuinely degraded. You might feel the same shame, irrational but very real, your first night in prison. At about 11, I began looking for a bed. I had read about doss houses. They are never called doss houses, by the way. And I suppose that one could get a bed for 4 pence or thereabouts. Seeing a man, a navvy or something of the kind, standing on the curb in the Waterloo Road, I stopped and questioned him. I said I was stony broke and wanted the cheapest bed I could get. "Oh," said he. "You go to that house across the street there, with the sign, good beds for single men. That's good kip. Sleeping place, that is. I've been there myself on and off. You find it cheap and clean." It was a tall, battered-looking house, with dim lights in all the windows, some of which were patched with brown paper. I entered a stone passageway, and a little etiolated boy with sleepy eyes appeared from a door leading to a cellar. Murmurous sounds came from the cellar, and a wave of hot air and cheese. The boy yawned and held out his hand. "Want a kip? That'll be all, governor." I paid the shilling, and the boy led me up a rickety, unlighted staircase to a bedroom. It had a sweetish reek of paregoric and foul linen, and the windows seemed to be tight shut, and the air was almost suffocating at first. There was a candle burning, and I saw that the room measured 15 square by 8 high, and had 8 beds in it. Already 6 lodgers were in bed, queer, lumpy shapes with all their own clothes, even their boots, piled on top of them. Someone was coughing in a loathsome manner in one corner. When I got into the bed, I found that it was as hard as a board. And as for the pillow, it was a mere hard cylinder, like a block of wood. It was rather worse than sleeping on a table, because the bed was not 6 feet long and very narrow, and the mattress was convex, so that one had to hold on to avoid falling out. The sheets stank so horribly of sweat that I could not bear them near my nose. Also, the bedclothes only consisted of the sheets and a cotton counterpane, so that, though stuffy, it was none too warm. Several noises recurred throughout the night. About once in an hour, the man on my left, a sailor I think, woke up, swore vilely, and lighted a cigarette. Another man, victim of a bladder disease, got up and noisily used his chamber pot 6 times during the night. The man in the corner had a coughing fit once in every 20 minutes, so regularly that one came to listen for it as one listens for the next yap when a dog is baying with the moon. It was an unspeakably repellent sound, a foul bubbling and retching, as though the man's bowels were being churned up within him. Once, when he struck a match, I saw that he was a very old man, with a grey sunken face like that of a corpse, and he was wearing his trousers wrapped around his head as a nightcap, a thing which for some reason disgusted me very much. Every time he coughed, or the other man swore, a sleepy voice from one of the other beds cried out, "Shut up! Oh, for Christ's sake, shut up!" I had about an hour's sleep in all. In the morning I was woken by a dim impression of some large brown thing coming towards me. I opened my eyes and saw it was one of the sailor's feet, sticking out of the bed close to my face. It was dark brown, quite dark brown, like an Indian's, with dirt. The walls were leprous, and the sheets, 3 weeks from the wash, were almost raw umber color. I got up, dressed, and went downstairs. In the cellar were a row of basins and 2 slippery roller towels. I had a piece of soap in my pocket, and I was going to wash when I noticed that every basin was streaked with grime, solid, sticky filth, as black as boot blacking. I went out unwashed. Altogether, the lodging house had not come up to its description as cheap and clean. It was, however, as I found later, a fairly representative lodging house. I crossed the river and walked a long way eastward, finally going into a coffee shop on Tower Hill. An ordinary London coffee shop like 1,000 others, it seemed queer and foreign after Paris. It was a little stuffy room with the high-backed pews that were fashionable in the 40s. The day's menu written on a mirror with a piece of soap, and a girl of 14 handling the dishes. Navvies were eating out of newspaper parcels and drinking tea in vast saucerless mugs, like china tumblers. In a corner by himself, a Jew, muzzle down in the plate, was guiltily wolfing baking. "Can I have some tea and bread and butter?" I said to the girl. She stared. "No butter? Only march," she said, surprised. And she repeated the order in the phrase that is to London what the eternal coup de rouge is to Paris. "Large tea and 2 slices." On the wall beside my pew, there was a notice saying, "Pocketing the sugar, not allowed." And beneath it some poetic customer had written, "He that takes away the sugar shall be called a dirty..." But someone else had been at pains to scratch out the last word. This was England. The tea and 2 slices cost 3 pence halfpenny, leaving me with 8 and 2 pence.